the sun rose slowly over the plains of Hindustan, casting its golden light across dusty villages, ancient temples, and sprawling Mughal ruins now overshadowed by the red brick offices of the East India Company. By the mid-19th century, India was no longer ruled by emperors or kings in the true sense. Instead, a trading corporation headquartered in London, the British East India Company, had woven its influence over much of the subcontinent. Its banners fluttered not just in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, but in forts, cantonments, and treasury houses spread across the land. On paper, many princely rulers still held their thrones. Nawabs, Rajas, and even the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar sat in Delhi's Red Fort. But in truth, these were shadows of power, symbols carefully preserved while their authority had been drained away. Real control lay in the hands of British officials, their soldiers, and their clerks. For the people of India, peasants, artisans, nobles, and soldiers alike, this new order carried both familiarity and alienation. Taxes were higher than before. Traditional industries such as weaving and handicrafts had collapsed under the flood of cheap machine-made British textiles. Ancient rights over land were uprooted as the company imposed new systems of revenue collection, forcing cultivators to squeeze the earth harder or lose their fields. Even proud landlords found themselves stripped of estates by a single stroke of foreign law. The British often justified their expansion by invoking the rhetoric of reform. They abolished practices like sati, the burning of widows on their husbands' pyres, and promoted Western education through English medium schools. Missionaries, under the shield of company protection, began spreading Christian teachings across towns and villages. To some, these reforms appeared as progress. To many more, they seemed like an attack on religion, custom, and the very rhythm of Indian life. Amidst this turmoil, the sepoys, the Indian soldiers serving under the company, watched closely. They were the backbone of British power, drawn from villages across the Ganges plain, from the proud Rajputs, Brahmins, and Awadhi Muslims who formed the Bengal army, to Marathas, Sikhs, and others who filled the company's ranks. For years, they had fought Britain's wars, against Maratha chieftains, against Afghan invaders, and in faraway lands like Burma. Yet their loyalty was fraying. The sepoys were bound by strict codes of caste and religion, but these were constantly tested in service. Crossing the sea for campaigns, for instance, threatened caste purity. Pay was meager compared to European soldiers, and opportunities for promotion were almost non-existent. Grievances simmered in silence, unspoken but deeply felt. By the early 1850s, the company's hunger for territory grew bolder. The infamous doctrine of lapse, introduced by Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, stripped Indian princes of their kingdoms if they died without a natural heir. Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, and Awadh fell victim to this policy. In Awadh, the fertile heartland of North India, annexation in 1856 threw thousands of nobles, soldiers, and clerks out of employment. The humiliation was profound. Here was a land of poets and warriors, suddenly reduced to a district in the company's map. Whispers began spreading across bazaars, tea shops, and temple courtyards. Could this foreign power truly be invincible? Was its rule permanent, or might it be overthrown? In Delhi, the aged Bahadur Shah Zafar, poet and mystic more than king, still held court in the shadow of faded Mughal grandeur. His empire had shrunk to the walls of his palace, yet his name carried resonance across Hindustan. For sepoys, peasants, and dispossessed nobles, the Mughal crown still symbolized legitimacy. By 1856, the air was thick with discontent. Farmers burdened by taxes cursed the company's revenue collectors. Artisans ruined by imports gazed with despair at idle looms. Landlords stripped of privilege plotted quietly in their estates. And sepoys, loyal yet restless, carried grievances that no officer cared to hear. The storm had not yet broken, but its clouds were gathering. In dusty parade grounds, in princely courts, in bazaars and shrines, the winds of rebellion stirred, waiting only for a spark. The clang of rifles, the beat of drums, and the bark of English sergeants echoed across the parade grounds of northern India. Here marched the sepoys, the Indian foot soldiers of the East India Company, men who bore the burden of empire on their shoulders but carried within them the pride of caste, religion, and tradition. The sepoy was no ordinary soldier. He was a peasant in uniform, often from a small village on the banks of the Ganges, or a Rajput hamlet in the rugged plains of Uttar Pradesh. His family tilled the soil, his brothers guarded ancestral fields, but he had chosen, or been compelled, to join the company's army. It was steady employment in uncertain times. The company provided food, clothing, and a small but regular wage. For many, it was survival. For others, it was prestige. In return, the sepoys gave the company loyalty, discipline, and blood. They had marched under British officers in distant campaigns, storming Maratha forts, subduing Punjab, advancing into Burma, and even serving overseas in lands they had never dreamed of. Yet in their ranks, grievances grew quietly, like cracks in a stone wall. At first glance, the sepoy's uniform seemed a mark of honor. But pay was meager, especially compared to European soldiers. Moreover, when campaigns took them across the seas, allowances meant to compensate for the loss of caste and separation from families were often withheld or reduced. Promotions were rare. No matter how skilled or brave an Indian sepoy was, he would never rise beyond the rank of Subedar. Higher command was reserved for Europeans alone. The inequality was obvious. A sepoy who bled in battle was treated as expendable, while his British counterpart enjoyed privilege, respect, and better pay. Resentment simmered but rarely found voice, for discipline was harsh and disobedience punished without mercy. The Bengal army, the largest of the company's three forces, drew heavily from high-caste Hindus and Muslims of Awadh and Bihar. These men carried with them deep concerns about purity, dietary rules, and ritual obligations. Any perceived violation of these customs was enough to spark unrest. The company often ignored these sensitivities. Marching orders sometimes required sepoys to cross seas, which, for many Hindus, meant losing caste. In regimental kitchens, Brahmins demanded separate cooking spaces, but these were not always provided. Even minor slights were taken as grave insults. The sepoys were proud men, bound by codes of honor older than the empire they served. To be treated as pawns by foreign masters stirred a quiet anger that grew with every passing year. It was in this tense climate that a spark appeared, the new Enfield rifle, introduced in 1856. Its cartridges came wrapped in paper coated with grease. To load the weapon, a soldier had to bite open the cartridge before pouring the powder into the barrel. Rumors spread swiftly. The grease was made from cow fat, offensive to Hindus, and pig fat, abhorrent to Muslims. For both communities, the act of biting such cartridges was unthinkable, a direct assault on their faith. The company dismissed the fears as superstition. Officers insisted the cartridges were harmless, and even suggested soldiers grease them with their own hands if they wished. But trust was already shattered. To many sepoys, this was proof of what they had long suspected, that the British sought to defile their religion, to make them Christians by stealth. Around campfires and in mess halls, whispers turned into oaths. "They want to destroy our faith," the soldiers murmured. Some believed it was part of a grand design: first, strip away the land of the princes, then the honor of the soldiers, and finally the soul of India itself. The annexation of Awadh in 1856 struck the sepoys especially hard. Thousands of soldiers hailed from its villages, and many had relatives who suddenly found themselves dispossessed. Noblemen who had once been patrons of these sepoys were reduced to poverty. Soldiers began to ask, if the company could strip their homeland of its rulers, could they not also strip soldiers of their dignity? Awadh's fall made the rebellion personal. For the sepoys, the insult was no longer abstract, it had touched their homes, their families, their traditions. By early 1857, discontent ran like an underground current through the Bengal army. Sepoys drilled by day and marched on parade, but in their hearts they carried suspicion and anger. British officers, blind to the depth of this unrest, continued to treat grievances as trifles. A few mutinies had already flared in smaller stations, but they were put down swiftly, dismissed as isolated acts of indiscipline. Yet in truth, the army was a tinderbox. The cartridge was merely the match. The rail fuel was years of humiliation, inequality, and wounded pride. The storm was gathering, silent but relentless. Soon, in the cantonment of Meerut, the first flames would erupt, and what began as a soldiers' protest would engulf an empire. The evening of May 9, 1857, in the dusty cantonment of Meerut, seemed unremarkable. British officers dined in their bungalows, sipping wine beneath slow-turning fans, while sepoys gathered in their barracks, their whispers thick with tension. Yet beneath the calm surface, an explosive anger was smouldering. The spark was already lit. Weeks earlier, sepoys of the 3rd Light Cavalry had refused to bite the new Enfield cartridges. To the British, this was blatant insubordination. To the soldiers, it was an act of faith. They would rather face punishment than betray their religion. On that May day, 85 sepoys were court-martialed and sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. In full view of their comrades, they were stripped of their uniforms, shackled, and marched off in chains. The humiliation was unbearable. Soldiers who had fought and bled for the company now saw their brothers treated as criminals for defending their beliefs. The air in the cantonment grew heavy. For the British officers, the matter was settled, discipline had been restored. For the sepoys, it was the final insult. The following evening, Sunday the 10th of May, the storm broke. As the bells of the church rang for evening service, the sepoys seized their moment. Muskets were loaded, torches lit. Suddenly, shots cracked through the twilight. The barracks of British soldiers were stormed, European officers cut down. The cantonment erupted in chaos. Flames leapt from bungalows as sepoys and townspeople joined in fury. British women and children fled, some seeking sanctuary in churches or barracks, others cut down in the streets. The city of Meerut, long simmering with resentment, now roared with rebellion. The imprisoned sepoys were freed by their comrades. Their chains were broken, their honor restored. Together, they turned their eyes toward Delhi. That night, under a sky thick with smoke, thousands of rebels set out on horseback and foot for the imperial city, just 40 miles away. Dust rose from the roads as they marched, chanting war cries, invoking faith and vengeance. Delhi was no ordinary destination, it was the heart of Hindustan, still guarded by the Red Fort and the name of the Mughal emperor. Though Bahadur Shah Zafar was a frail poet in his 70s with little power, his throne carried the memory of centuries. If the rebellion needed legitimacy, it could only be found beneath his crown. As dawn broke on May 11th, the sepoys reached the gates of Delhi. The guards, themselves sepoys, hesitated only for a moment before joining their brothers. The city awoke to the thunder of revolt. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah Zafar sat in his palace, composing verses of melancholy, when the rebels burst in. Breathless, covered in dust and blood, they demanded he take command of the uprising. At first, the old emperor resisted. He was weary, reluctant, and wary of British wrath. Yet the tide of rebellion was unstoppable. "You are our leader," the sepoys declared, "the only rightful ruler of Hindustan." Outside, the streets of Delhi echoed with gunfire and cries of vengeance. British civilians, clerks, and families tried desperately to escape, but many fell to the fury of the mob. The British Residency was stormed, its defenders cut down. Within hours, Delhi, city of emperors, had fallen into rebel hands. The Mughal flag once again flew above the Red Fort. When Bahadur Shah Zafar reluctantly gave his blessing to the rebels, the mutiny was transformed into something far greater. What had begun as a sepoy protest in Meerut was now a full-fledged rebellion under the banner of the Mughal emperor. News of Delhi's fall spread like wildfire across the plains of northern India. In bazaars, villages, and cantonments, the cry went out, "Delhi has risen. The emperor has returned." To peasants crushed by taxes, to dispossessed landlords, to sepoys nursing grievances, Delhi became a beacon of hope. For the British, it was a thunderclap of terror. An empire built over a century was suddenly shaken to its core. By mid-May, the rebellion had crossed the point of no return. It was no longer about cartridges or pay, it had become a war for dignity, faith, and freedom. At Meerut, the company had believed it was enforcing discipline. In truth, it had unleashed a storm. The road to Delhi had opened the floodgates of rebellion. From Kanpur to Lucknow, Jhansi to Gwalior, the flames would spread, consuming princes and peasants, sepoys and civilians alike. The First War of Independence had begun. The news of Delhi's uprising swept across Hindustan like a monsoon storm. Villages whispered it in hushed awe, towns shouted it in bazaars, and sepoys in distant cantonments repeated it with swelling pride, "Delhi is ours. The emperor rules again." For over a century, the Mughals had been mere figureheads, shadows of their former glory. Yet now, in the summer of 1857, the Red Fort once more became the beating heart of resistance. Though Bahadur Shah Zafar was old, frail, and more poet than king, his name carried legitimacy. His reluctant blessing transformed a scattered mutiny into a rebellion with a crown. When the rebels arrived on May 11th, Bahadur Shah Zafar greeted them with hesitation. At 73, he had little appetite for politics. His court had long been a haven for poets, mystics, and artists rather than generals and statesmen. Yet the sepoys pressed him, swords still bloody, uniforms torn from battle. "You are our emperor," they declared, kneeling before him. "Lead us, or all is lost." Zafar looked out from the marble pavilions of his palace and saw the truth. Delhi was already aflame, the British driven out, the people clamoring for leadership. If he refused, chaos would consume the city. If he accepted, he would bear the weight of an empire's hopes and the wrath of Britain. At last, he relented. The faded emperor of poets became the sovereign of rebels. His seal was placed upon proclamation summoning the people of Hindustan to rise. His court, once filled with verse and song, now throbbed with the noise of war councils and petitions. The fall of Delhi to the rebels was not a clean victory but a descent into fury. In the days that followed, mobs surged through the city, hunting down Europeans and those seen as collaborators. British civilians, clerks, missionaries, women, and children were caught in the whirlwind. Some were slaughtered in the chaos, others fled in disguise, and a few found temporary refuge with sympathetic Indian families. The killings shocked even Bahadur Shah Zafar, who pleaded for restraint. But the tide was beyond his control. For many in Delhi, the violence was vengeance for years of humiliation, high taxes, and foreign rule. Meanwhile, artisans and shopkeepers reopened long-shuttered workshops, convinced that Mughal glory had returned. Nobles who had lost estates to the company flocked to the court, pledging loyalty to the emperor. Delhi was alive with a dangerous hope. The rebel sepoys, though united in anger, were not always united in purpose. Each regiment brought its own leaders, its own ambitions. Discipline was fragile. Some pushed for organized defense against the British, others spent their days plundering. Yet amid the disorder, figures of courage emerged. Bakht Khan, an artillery officer from Bareilly, arrived in Delhi with his men and soon took a leading role. A man of discipline and charisma, he became the backbone of the city's defense, advising the emperor and attempting to forge order out of chaos. Still, the Mughal court was no stronghold of unity. Factions bickered, old rivalries resurfaced, and the emperor's authority, though respected, often failed to bind the sepoys into a single force. The loss of Delhi stunned the British. In Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, officials scrambled to secure garrisons. But in the north, there was no time for hesitation. If Delhi remained in rebel hands, the company's rule would unravel. By late June, British forces under General Archdale Wilson advanced toward Delhi, reinforced by loyal Sikh regiments and Gurkhas from Nepal. They established a camp on the ridge just north of the city, overlooking its walls. The ridge became a battleground of endurance. The summer sun blazed mercilessly, the monsoon rains turned the ground to mud, and cholera swept through the camp. Supplies were scarce, and every advance toward the city walls was met with ferocious fire from rebel artillery. Yet the British, though battered, clung to their position. They knew that without Delhi, their empire was doomed. Inside Delhi, the atmosphere grew tense. At first, there was jubilation. Proclamations were read in markets, poets composed verses celebrating the emperor's return, and the people dreamt of a Hindustan free of company rule. But as weeks turned into months, reality set in. Food grew scarce, prices soared, and the city's administration faltered. Rival commanders clashed, and order slipped through the emperor's frail hands. Still, the Red Fort remained a beacon. Couriers carried Safar's proclamations to distant towns, calling upon Hindus and Muslims alike to rise against the foreign rulers. His words, though penned by a weary hand, stirred hearts across the land. The English are the enemies of God and man. Rise, and rid Hindustan of their tyranny. For 4 long months, Delhi held out. But by early September, the British had reinforced their lines, bringing heavy artillery. On September 14, after a furious bombardment, the assault began. Cannons thundered against the walls, breaches opened, and waves of soldiers stormed through. Street by street, Delhi became a battlefield. Rebels fought desperately, but the British advanced relentlessly, bayonets flashing in narrow lanes, muskets firing into houses. The Yamuna ran red with blood as the old city fell. By September 20, the struggle was over. The Red Fort was captured, its halls echoing with silence. Bahadur Shah Zafar, once a poet king of Hindustan, was dragged from his palace as a prisoner. His sons were executed, their bodies left unclaimed. The Mughal dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, ended in humiliation. The fall of Delhi unleashed a terrible vengeance. The British, enraged by the slaughter of Europeans in May, exacted a brutal retribution. Entire neighborhoods were burned, suspected rebels executed en masse, and the city that had once been the jewel of Hindustan was reduced to ruin. Delhi's dream had lasted only 4 months. But those 4 months burned themselves into memory, not as a victory, but as a symbol of defiance. The fall of Delhi into rebel hands electrified Hindustan. News traveled faster than the monsoon winds, passed along by wandering farkers, merchants, and sepoy couriers. From the banks of the Ganges to the plains of Bundelkhand, one cry echoed, "The emperor has risen, the company has fallen." But Delhi was only the spark. Across northern and central India, rebellion spread like wildfire, engulfing cities and cantonments. In each place, the story unfolded differently, yet always with the same refrain: anger against the company, the hope of freedom, and the fire of vengeance. In the fertile heart of Awadh, the city of Kanpur, then spelled Kaunpur, became a crucible of the revolt. Here, the figure at the center was Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the last Maratha Peshwa, Baji Rao II. For years, Nana Sahib had lived in Kanpur, wealthy but embittered. The company had refused to honor his adoptive father's pension, dismissing his claims with cold bureaucracy. To Nana Sahib, it was a personal betrayal, a reminder that Indian princes and nobles meant nothing to the British but obstacles to be brushed aside. When the revolt broke out, Nana Sahib declared himself leader of the rebels at Kanpur. His ally, the fiery General Tantia Tope, took command of forces, while sepoys defected from the company's ranks to join their cause. The British, caught unprepared, retreated into an entrenchment by the river. There, under a burning June sun, they endured weeks of siege. Food ran low, water grew foul, disease spread. Women and children huddled in tents as shells rained down. On June 27, after promises of safe passage, the exhausted survivors surrendered to Nana Sahib. They were led to the riverbank, supposedly to board boats for Allahabad. But treachery awaited. As the boats pushed off, they were fired upon, many drowned or were cut down. The survivors, mostly women and children, were taken prisoner. Weeks later, as British relief forces approached, these captives, around 200 in number, were brutally massacred in the Bibigar house. The killing stained Nana Sahib's name forever in British memory. To Indians, he remained both a betrayed son of the Marathas and a symbol of resistance, but the massacre would become one of the most infamous episodes of the rebellion. If Kanpur was a tale of betrayal and blood, Lucknow was one of endurance and siege. The capital of Awadh, annexed only a year earlier, was aflame with resentment. The city's nobility, soldiers, and people had all lost under British rule, and now they rose in defiance. The focal point of the struggle was the British Residency, a sprawling complex where officials and their families sought refuge. As rebels closed in, the Residency became a fortress. For months, Lucknow endured one of the most dramatic sieges in history. Shells crashed through walls, houses burned, and disease ravaged the defenders. Food was scarce, water tainted, yet the garrison held on. Indian servants and loyal sepoys stood side by side with their British masters, while outside, rebel forces tightened their grip. Relief came in September when General Havelock and later Sir Colin Campbell fought their way into the city. But even then, the struggle continued, with fresh sieges and counterattacks. Lucknow became a symbol of British resilience to the colonizers, of defiance to the rebels. The city bled, its palaces shattered, its streets filled with corpses. Far to the south, in the rugged land of Bundelkhand, a queen rose to legend. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, widowed and denied her throne by Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, became one of the fiercest leaders of the revolt. When rebellion reached Jhansi, Lakshmibai at first hesitated, caught between loyalty to the company and sympathy for her people. But when British officers were slain in the uprising, she took control, organizing defenses, training troops, and ruling with iron resolve. Clad in armor, riding her horse with her young son strapped to her back, the Rani became a vision of courage. In March 1858, when British forces under Sir Hugh Rose besieged Jhansi, she fought with unmatched valor. Cannons roared from the fort, walls blazed with musket fire, and the Queen herself rode into battle. But the odds were overwhelming. Jhansi fell after fierce fighting. Refusing surrender, Lakshmibai escaped through the flames and joined forces with Tantia Tope. Her final stand came at Gwalior in June 1858. Leading her troops into battle, she fought like a lioness until she fell, sword in hand. To the British, she was the Jezebel of India. To her people, she was immortal, the warrior queen who defied an empire. Her name would echo through history as one of the brightest flames of 1857. In Lucknow, while sepoys and nobles took up arms, a woman of regal dignity assumed leadership, Begum Hazrat Mahal, wife of the deposed Nawab of Awadh. With her husband exiled to Calcutta, the Begum declared her young son, Burjis Khadr, as ruler, and herself regent. From the grand palaces of Lucknow, she issued proclamations calling Hindus and Muslims alike to unite against the foreigners. She condemned the company's annexations and taxes, and she rallied both nobles and commoners to the cause. Though eventually driven into exile, Begum Hazrat Mahal stood as proof that the rebellion was not merely a Sepoy mutiny, but a struggle that drew in rulers, queens, and commoners alike. By mid-1857, rebellion stretched from the Punjab to Bihar, from central India to the borders of Rajasthan. Some regions, like Bengal and the south, remained quiet, their rulers loyal to the company. But in the north and center, the land was ablaze. Everywhere, stories of defiance mingled with tales of horror. Villages rose up against tax collectors, princes reclaimed lost thrones, and peasants struck at symbols of authority. Yet the rebellion was not unified. Each center rose for its own reasons, grievances over land, pensions, religion, or honor. There was no single leader, no single strategy, only a shared hatred of the company. For the British, the revolt was both military and psychological. Their empire, once thought unshakable, now seemed fragile. Telegraph lines were cut, railways destroyed, and communication severed. Panic spread in Calcutta and London alike. Could the jewel of the empire be slipping from their grasp? For the rebels, Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi became symbols, proof that the company could bleed, that the foreign rulers were not invincible. The land was in flames, and the outcome uncertain.